Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hello, everyone. Today, we are going to talk about childhood trauma, particularly in the context of bringing it into a relationship and how that works, and a lot of the emotional baggage that it can create. And I would say most children at some point in their lives will go through something traumatic, wide variety of things that can be traumatic for a child. And I think really what makes the difference is how it's handled by adults surrounding them, and how it's processed as children. I myself did not escape a childhood without a trauma. So let's first talk about what makes an experience traumatizing for a child, how it's created.
And so trauma, in children, it's a really hard subject to talk about because a lot of people are uncomfortable even thinking that traumatic experiences exist for children. And so, but even using the term trauma is pretty wide, and
it's very
wide. Not necessarily vague, but the way we think of trauma most often, I think the most common would fall under probably childhood sexual abuse. And then the other heading of what we might call childhood neglect. And we'll go into more detail of what those things are. But in general, what makes an experience traumatic? I think one, if you are afraid, and so intense fear, but that can come in any number of ways, right? It can come from a parent. It can come from an experience, say, getting lost. Let's say you're lost in a theme park or something. That can be certainly traumatic. If you are
being in a car accident,
having health issues. And this is one that we often don't think about. But if you think about a young child, let's say they're young, they're going to have their tonsils out. Something as simple as that. We don't think how traumatic it's going to be. There you are as a parent, and this kid is still awake, lying on the table, rolling into the operating room, has no idea what's going to happen. I mean, if you think about it as adults, that experience is, can be pretty traumatic. And so you have this young kid, and I think it's hard because we don't understand what are the long-term ramifications of that, but they're real. So trauma events happen to a lot of us. And they're even things that we might not think either should be or could be traumatic. And so it's very individual. It's what each child experiences in the moment.
Right.
So there are health issues, hospital visits, accidents, as you said, trauma in the home like fire, things like that. But what makes it traumatic for the kid? Here's another piece. It's called resilience. So we often talk about a child being resilient. And one of the things that we're not really clear on, what is resilience? There is a book. I'm sure there are several books, but he's by a local Salt Lake author. It's a psychologist. His name's Sam Goldstein. And he wrote a book. I think the title is Resilient, and exploring what is that. And so I don't know that we should spend the time today talking about resilience. That could be even a topic for a future session, because I think that there are ways that we can help children be more resilient. But if you're looking at what makes a difference, because you could take two kids and expose them to the same event, and one is going to be traumatized and one may not be traumatized. And the only difference that we can figure out is resilience. But the resilience, as you mentioned, I think you mentioned this, it has to do with what do we do after the experience as parents and caregivers? And so that's probably a good topic for a future podcast. But if we go back to probably the most common types of trauma that kids encounter, I mean, the first one most people think about is childhood sexual abuse. And the This has always been the trouble. I mean, if you look at percentages of, how many children experience that, we can get an idea, but the percentages aren't going to be very good. And here's the reason why is because each jurisdiction typically has a different definition of what that means.
Okay.
And so there's no standard of this qualifies for childhood sexual abuse. And so this is kind of typical, and it's been this rate for as long as I can remember. About 20% of females or young girls will experience some sort of sexual trauma. And then for boys, it used to be a little less, 5 to 10%, but I think that's increasing. And that's certainly true with the people that we see, in our office, is that there are more males presenting for sexual abuse as children. And I think one of the differences is it becomes a little bit easier for men to talk about it. I think in the past, it wasn't one of those things that men would ever acknowledge or talk about. But I think we can all agree on it happens way too often. Well, even one case is way too often.
Way too often. Yeah.
Way too often. And then the other big issue with abuse or traumatic events, we would call neglect. And neglect is actually the number one traumatic event for children, but it encompasses a lot of things. And so physical neglect or maltreatment or abuse. And so there are certainly children who experience physical neglect or abuse from a parent, where punishment goes too far. General neglect, lack of adequate food, lack of adequate shelter, lack of adequate medical care. And then the other big one would be emotional neglect, which would be, lack of affection, lack of connection. I mean, kind of the classic example of that, which would be the orphanages that used to be in the Eastern Bloc countries, where the children would not have any type of touch or connection, and they'd be in the cribs all day. And there was really severe attachment problems and issues that went on with those kids. And so even emotional neglect, the problem with those general neglect, emotional neglect, even physical neglect, really hard to substantiate. And so from my experience, this is actually where I started my career so many years ago, was with a nonprofit in Salt Lake called the Family Support Center. And at one time for a couple of years, I was the clinical director there. And so I really had a lot to do with, helping children who had suffered some sort of abuse. And it was all those that I just went over, the sexual abuse and the neglect. And it's in our work there are state laws, probably in every state, reporting laws that mandate, if, as a therapist, actually, people think it's just therapists who have to report, but it's everyone. The law is all encompassing. If anyone finds out about the abuse of a child, at least in Utah, I guess I shouldn't say for other states, but in Utah, I know this is true, then they are required by law to report it. And the problem is you report to DCFS, the Division of Child and Family Services. That's what we call it in Utah. And the problem is they have to have evidence that then supports them opening a case and following through with it. And so more often than not, they don't follow through. And it's not because they don't want to. It's because they really can't. And again, I'll just mention this briefly, not to go into it in too much detail, but part of the problem is the justice system and how we treat children in the justice system. And so if you think of adults, and if you say you're going to court and they're going to ask you, well, when did this happen? How did it happen? What do you remember? That is never going to work for a kid.
Right.
And so you're never going to have the same level of evidence for a child who's saying, this is what happened to me, as you would for an adult. But yet in the justice system, we really treat them that way. So it's a problem with reporting, because a lot of us who have worked with children or work with children find it really frustrating, because often nothing changes. At least one of the hard things in Utah, again, is the state mandates, at least with DCFS, that even with sexual abuse or any type of abuse, the primary goal is what they call reunification.
Yep.
And often from the therapist standpoint, that is not the therapeutic goal for the child.
Yeah, I could see that in terms of abuse. I think particularly sexual abuse, I think that would be it's horrifying. And I don't
It
think there's
is.
anything more horrifying than that happening between a parent and a child.
Hmm.
But if it does and if it's properly substantiated and it's proved, then I don't think we
Well, right.
would.
If that's the case, then they generally end up in prison, and
Oh, okay.
which is not a bad thing. I'm
Yeah,
talking
I
about,
agree.
well, as a therapist, there's some. This happens so much, so often that we know there's some abuse, and even DCFS is willing to acknowledge that there's some abuse. There's
Hmm.
not enough to take it to court and have a criminal proceeding, but yet the end goal is still reunification. And
Hmm.
so, even though the child might be removed for a time period, the goal is always to get them back, and
Yeah.
that's really heartbreaking
Hmm.
to see that. So, the neglect happens a lot, and it's very hard to substantiate. We know it, though.
Hmm.
I have seen all of these in adults over the years in my office, the sexual abuse and then all of those neglects. And so the question might be, well, what does that do as you become an adult? And
Right.
how do you deal with that? And how do you deal with it if you're, individual not in a relationship? Or what is the influence, or what's the ramification when you want to go into a relationship?
Exactly.
I think in some past podcasts, I've talked about attachment, and I just want to bring it up a little bit briefly here. I don't want to get too stuck in it. But attachment is the thing that the window, we really think about the window of really forming a good attachment is anywhere between 18 months, and 2 years, somewhere in there. And what it is, it's, for example, here, a good attachment would be as a parent, you probably experience this. As a
Hmm.
parent, you kind of know your child's cries. Like there's one maybe when they're hungry, there's one when they're hurt, and they sound different.
Yes.
And so when you experience that from the child and then you respond to the need, see, the child can't say anything to you, right? All
Hmm.
they can do is cry,
Yeah.
and you can respond to the need. But even trying to meet the need is saying to the child, I see you, I hear you, and I want to help you through this.
Hmm.
And that essentially in the early years is how attachment is formed. And
Okay.
so, again, a classic example of how attachment doesn't happen is sometimes, if we talked a couple of weeks ago about postpartum depression, and sometimes if the depression is severe, then often the caregiver, often the mother, can't respond adequately or properly to
Hmm.
the needs of the child. And so that attachment becomes disrupted.
Interesting.
And so that can happen throughout childhood and adolescence. And so if you think about traumatic event, say sexual abuse, then often or neglect, maltreatment, physical maltreatment, lack of food,
Hmm.
lack of shelter, the
Hmm.
child doesn't feel safe, and
Hmm.
their needs aren't being met in a very fundamental way. And
Hmm.
so that disrupts the attachment. And there's one that I wanted to talk about that I think will really make sense to our listeners. And it's one that there are different words that people put to attachment, but this one is called disorganized attachment.
Okay.
And so here's disorganized attachment. These are children that have had experience in some way with their primary caregivers that in some way were terrifying,
Okay.
or their caregivers were in some way terrified. So it can also be, I'm terrified as a child, or I see this person who's supposed to take care of me, I see that person being terrified as well. And so when you experience that terror, then the child experiences kind of this deep state of distress.
Okay.
And so here's the problem though. When a child is in deep state of distress, then the brain says, okay, go to your caregiver for
Hmm.
soothing
Hmm.
or to take care of the problem. But the main problem is, well, the caregiver is the one who's giving me distress. And so it's a real conflict in the circuitry of the brain. And it's this simultaneous activation of these two neural circuits of I'm being terrorized and I need to go to the person who is terrorizing me for comfort.
Okay. Yeah.
And so what happens is what we call dissociation. And I don't know if that's a term that a lot of people are familiar with it. And one of the best ways to describe dissociation is like checking out. It almost looks like daydreaming, but it's an intense form of daydreaming. I've certainly had many clients who at times dissociate, and it can be scary for them. Like one time, they're in a car and something triggers them and they dissociate. And then a half hour later, they are somewhere. They don't know how they got there.
Oh, wow.
But they did. Mm-hmm. And miraculously, they got there safe, but they have no recollection of it. Another way to experience dissociation is what we call a loss of time. And so, it might be 10:30 and then all of a sudden it's 11:30 and I have no idea where that hour went or what happened to it. And so the amazing thing, I think the brain is so amazing because dissociation is a way to protect the child emotionally. Yeah. Even if and this happens a lot in childhood sexual abuse, that when especially if the sexual abuse is prolonged, it's ongoing, then one way to protect yourself is to dissociate during the event. And so this coping mechanism that really is protective when you're a child or an adolescent, when you then become an adult, is very maladaptive. And that's generally what causes the difficulty in intimate relationships. So, for example, let's say you've been sexually abused and then you get married and things are okay, but when maybe you're engaging in sexual relationship, the automatic response might be to dissociate because your experience with that is traumatic.
Right.
And so that causes a disconnection. Dissociation is really about disconnection from your world around you, both emotionally and physically. And so that's just one of the really common negative side effects of abuse. But I think that dissociation can happen. It can certainly I've seen it happen in children where it's just verbal abuse.
Okay.
Because so it can be verbal abuse. They're being yelled at there, and that can, if they're being yelled at often by a father, fathers have deep voices. They're big, they're scary. And even though there's no physical threat, it is so scary for a young child. And so one of the ways they cope is they learn to dissociate because it takes them away temporarily from that terrifying situation and keeps them emotionally safe.
Interesting. And one of the things that Lindy and I talked about when we did our episode on talking to kids about suicide and sexuality was the resiliency of kids. We did address that and how kids can be extremely resilient if they have at least one safe person that they can trust through whatever event is going on. And the number one thing that a parent or an adult can do is be completely honest and transparent with your child. The worst thing you can do is lie or try to skirt around the truth with the child. And usually it's done out of love and in a parent's desire to protect the child, but it's more damaging than it is helpful.
I agree with that. And I think the reason parents, struggle with that is often it certainly is about, I don't want to traumatize my child more by being honest. But the problem is they also lack a way of being age appropriate in what they're saying. True. And that's often, you can consult with someone like Lindy who deals with children all the time and she does this often, helping parents find age appropriate ways to talk to children about things. And so it's not that you just say this to a child in an adult way, because that's not going to be helpful either. Exactly, and so I think getting help for parents in how do you talk to kids about it. So I agree with what you said that, if you have that one person that you can hold on to that becomes a safe person and your go-to person, that really helps build resiliency. Sadly, the problem is often it's both parents, who are in on either neglect and there's nowhere they can go. And so they're stuck with the trauma. But going back to what happens as an adult, I think that really the end result is it causes difficulties in intimate relationships. And that goes back to the attachment has been ruptured. But I really believe that you can repair attachment even as an adult.
Okay.
And so it's not that you're never going to be able to have really fulfilling relationships. I don't believe that. I mean, that, a great deal of my practice is really helping couples to have a better emotional connection. And I have most of my couples I have do an attachment assessment, which then helps them to determine what is their attachment style. Mm-hmm. And I can give the reference if anyone wants to do that. Just there's a book called Improve Your Relationship EQ.
Okay.
And the author's name is Isabel Kirk. I think in chapters, I think it's 1 and 2, in chapters 1 and 2, she does a really great job of explaining what attachment is. Now, somewhere I think in the second chapter, she's going to reference a website where you can go and for free take an attachment assessment.
Okay.
And the attachment assessment, at least from a therapeutic standpoint, is really helpful. It kind of jumpstarts the therapy if you know what the attachment is. And so I always look at that. And then if there is some sort of disorganized attachment or insecure ambivalent attachment or avoidant attachment, that then says, okay, let's follow up on where does this come from? And we do a little bit more what I call family of origin work to figure out what, any unusual experiences like abuse, physical abuse. Did you have enough to eat? The sexual abuse is really hard to deal with, and that's probably the most common. But if you've ever known anyone who experienced food insecurity as a child, or even shelter insecurity, it is really devastating. It's one of those basic needs that Maslow talked about that you have to have met. Is I've got to have enough food and I've got to feel safe and I've got to have a place to stay warm. And when you don't, that is really traumatic for children and with some lifelong results.
Curtis is one of those. He suffered all three of those at some point as a kid. And I think part of it has resulted in some health issues around food insecurity and his eating. And I've definitely seen that. I would also like to share my own personal experience. I suffered sexual abuse as a young child, and it was at a sleepover. And it's why my kids don't do sleepovers, because they're so dangerous. And so in a way, I knew this person, but I didn't know this person very well. And what I did is I pretended to sleep through it. I was only 8 years old and I was really, really uncomfortable. And so I pretended to sleep through it.
And that's a common response, just so you know.
I'm sure it is. Yeah. And so what happened is I couldn't identify exactly who it was, and that slowed proceedings. And so shortly after this happened, my parents ended up moving out of the state, which looking back was, I think, huge for me as a coping mechanism. And I think, and that was part of why I think maybe my parents did move out of the state. I think the main reason was my dad's employment. But I think part of it is they knew they needed to get me out of that situation and away from this neighbor, because it was a friend's house. And what happened with me is, for years, this happened when I was 18 years old. And from then until the time I was about 12 or 13, I literally forgot about it. And my mind, and I didn't know at the time, but my mind mentally completely just blocked it out.
See, and that's a coping mechanism to keep you emotionally safe.
And so what happened is when I was, around the age of between 11 and 13, I started remembering it, and it created all of these really weird insecurities, and I was able to kind of cope with it and deal with it okay until around the time I got engaged. And then this started to come back. And thankfully, I was able to be open and honest with Curtis about it. And he was very kind, very compassionate, and very supportive. But I did a little bit of talk therapy in preparation, because I know what marriage involves, and marriage involves being sexually intimate. And I knew that I was going to be carrying that emotional baggage into my relationship. And I also knew that we wanted to have kids. And I was extremely, extremely uncomfortable with the idea of a pelvic exam. very, very
Sure.
uncomfortable with it. And, and I was able to overcome that. And one thing I would like to say to anyone who has suffered from sexual abuse, exams are a part of life, they're a part of health. And if you have suffered, you need to be open and tell your doctor about it. I think
Yes.
I just want to put that out there. That's really, really important to talk to your doctor. So I've been able to come to terms with it. And that's the way the therapist talked to me about it. He said, it's one of those things, in order to when you've successfully handled it, is when it's something that doesn't feel traumatic anymore. You don't shy away from it. It's almost like being able to shake hands with it as a part of your past.
Right.
And it's not that you should ever accept it as okay, because no matter what, it was never okay that it happened.
Right.
And it was never a child's fault, ever. You have to get to a point where you can think about it and not feel that trauma. And it took years and a lot of open conversations, but I was able to do it. And I have a very successful, healthy relationship, both emotionally and sexually. And it's not a problem. And so anyone suffering, there is hope.
Right. And I think, talk therapy is certainly important for adults. And I agree with you on all the things that you said, that it can be a long-term process. And one of the ways I conceptualize it is that we all want to have what I call a coherent narrative of our life. And part of what you're doing in talk therapy as an adult is trying to make sense of your life. And so often it's just about pulling the pieces of the puzzle together. Now, there is a fair amount of controversy, I think I can say that, around what we call repressed memories. I believe it happens. I absolutely know it happens.
Yeah.
And the listeners are going to know, and they'll hear, and they'll find on the internet. And I'm not going to mention her name because I don't want to be sued. But there is a fairly well-known psychologist, used to be at the University of Washington and somewhere in California now. I think she does a lot of damage because, telling people that it absolutely doesn't happen. I don't believe it. I think it's a mechanism that the brain uses it's protective. And so, I don't know what happens, what is it that causes then the memories to start coming back? I always thought it was when you're safe enough,
I can see
when
that.
you're emotionally safe enough. So yes, talk therapy in order to, as an adult, to create that coherent narrative, to make sense of your life. And then I think that's acceptance. I think the other thing that I want to emphasize, your parents moving away is incredibly protective, because even though maybe the reason of the abuse was secondary, but still it's that the distance gives you a sense of safety, because you aren't going to walk down the street and see this person. You aren't going to walk by the house, and all of those can be triggers. And it's pretty common that we see adults who were abused by someone, a family member, and they're still in contact with the family member. And that is really, really tough. It's a tough situation. I don't think it's good for the person who was abused.
Yeah.
But often there are extenuating circumstances. Now, the one thing I want to mention briefly about kids, if and I think this goes for any abuse or trauma or neglect. And I don't know if when you were with Lindy, she talked about child-centered play therapy.
Yes.
And so I think that the type of therapy that a child gets is really important. And again, I'm going to make a pretty absolute statement, which I typically don't do, but I'm going to here. I think and the age is variable, but kids, let's just pick 12. Kids under the age of 12 cannot do talk therapy because cognitively they are not able to do that.
Interesting.
I think as they get older, then it becomes more likely that they can do talk therapy. And so the type of therapy Lindy does with children is called child-centered play therapy. And if anyone's interested, it was developed by a man named Gary Landreth out of the University of North Texas. A lot of research on it. You can go to their website. I think it is by far the most effective therapy for children, no matter what the issue is, if they're under the age of 12.
And I remember, and my parents, of course, took it to court. And And I remember for me as a child, talking to someone, and we drew a picture of a body, we labeled it, and we talked about what happened. And that kind of sounds like the same thing. And so going back to triggers a little bit, part of, I think, my problem, why it took me so long to come to terms with it, and one of my really big struggles was the fact that shortly, again, I couldn't identify him, but the main suspect in this case fled to Mexico. And, I, to this day, no idea. I still have no idea. But I'm still triggered by certain people who, and it's pretty specific, and I work very, very, very hard to conceal this, but certain people who look and talk a very, very specific way trigger me, and it makes me extremely and instantly uncomfortable. Yeah. And I work very hard to cover that up, because that's not fair to this person whom I've never met before in my life. But it's something that I acknowledge and that I deal with.
Yeah. And again, that's a pretty common, response. And so I certainly understand it. And I don't, of course, it's not fair to the person, but I think that's not even relevant in this moment, because you're dealing with something that happened in your past. Mm-hmm. And, our brain is such that we hold those. They're in the center of our brain in the limbic system. And I think over time it can fade, but it's very real, very real.
Yeah, it absolutely is. So if you have a child who has been through this and you need some resources, some additional resources, please feel free to reach out to me or to Dr.
Yeah,
Burton.
send us an email. And we can address it, because there are probably a lot of people who might want the additional resources. And that's certainly something we can do, is talk about that.
Yes, exactly. And so if you need specific resources, we can help you with that. If you would like us to address it on the air, we certainly can. If you'd like us to address it off the air, we're also willing to do that. I would imagine that there are a vast number of resources that are provided for free for children who have survived any type of abuse or neglect.
Well, so I mentioned the Family Support Center. So this is something in Utah, and certainly there it's either free or low fee. But at least when I was involved with them, that's been many, many years. That was really and they had state money and federal money that paid for that type of treatment. But that was the focus, was any type of child neglect. I think that in Utah also they have what are called children's justice centers. And those are, in fact, I see billboards out there sometimes, advertising that is a place for parents to go if they have questions about, what can be done about this.
Right. And also I would urge parents to seek professional help if, for one, they've been through it themselves and haven't dealt with it. And also if they have a child who's dealing with it, because you can be honest with your child, you can do all the right things, and maybe it's enough, but chances are you're probably missing something unintentionally. Right. I mean, right. I think when a child goes through something traumatic, the parent wants to do everything they possibly can. And that should absolutely include professional help, because for one, you're going to be traumatized by it yourself, that something horrible has happened to your child. And for another, your child's going to pick up on that. And so I think it's important for them to have someone disconnected that can remain calm. Next week, we're going to talk about, maybe this is often a result of this, personality disorders. So
it can be.
Sadly, it can be.
It can be. You're right. And it's a really interesting one. I look forward to it.
Stay tuned for that, and we will talk to you all next week. Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.